In a fast-paced tech environment, the potential attack surface increases with each release and new app created. Detectify automates cutting-edge knowledge from trusted ethical hackers into the development pipeline for reliable application security. Go beyond the OWASP Top 10. Check your web apps for over 2,000 known vulnerabilities actively exploited in the wild, monitor subdomains for potential takeovers, and remediate security issues in staging and production. Learn more with a free trial at securityweekly.com/Detectify. Go hack yourself. By connecting to your code repository, AccuRx generates a topology across your full stack to reveal risks so that you can harden your architecture. It also scans code for violations against compliance and security standards to enforce best practices. In addition, AccuRx develops threat models using vulnerability feeds, IAM privileges, and other data to predict potential breach paths. Learn how easy it is to get started with AccuRx at securityweekly.com/AccuRx. Application security is hard when security is separated from your DevOps workflow. Security has traditionally been the final hurdle in the development lifecycle. Iterative development workflows can make security a release bottleneck. With GitLab, security is built into the CI/CD process. Every code commit is automatically scanned for security vulnerabilities in your code and its dependencies. Results are delivered to the developer in their native workflow for rapid remediation. Learn how GitLab enables DevSecOps. Visit securityweekly.com/GitLab for a 30-day free trial.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman and John Kinsella. Security Weekly, in partnership with Cyber Risk Alliance, is excited to present Security Weekly Unlocked on December 10th, 2020. This one-day virtual event wraps up with the 15th anniversary edition of Pulse Security Weekly Live on YouTube. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to view the agenda. It's been updated. We've got it live for you, and come register for free. We also have webcasts, lots of webcasts. Learn how to build an integrated security platform in our webcast on October 28th. On November 5th, we'll show you how to build proper metrics and KPIs. On November 12th, learn why you should stop trying to discover and classify data. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to see what we have coming up, or visit securityweekly.com/on-demand to view our previously recorded webcasts. And that brings us to news of the week for the last week of October, which does lead up into my favorite day of the year, Halloween. But before we get into some of the more spookier and scarier Halloween puns and references, Matt, you've brought us some InfoSec and application security news as well. Let's talk about some botnets, it looks like.
Yeah, well, when I go out and I get ready for the next show, Business Security Weekly, I occasionally run across application security articles. You guys love to dig into some of the technical stuff, but I pulled a couple articles I thought were interesting for the audience as we kind of figure out, what do you guys want to hear from us. This was an interesting one around Kashmir Black, the botnet infection that's going on out there. What I thought was interesting about this is, look, there's a lot of bot traffic out there. We know that this Kashmir Black appears to be targeting a lot of WordPress plugins. And look, a lot of us run WordPress websites for our main websites. And so this is a huge potential attack vector that is being, exploited out there. So I figured we'd cover it, see, since it is application specific, and just inform our listeners to look for, these types of attacks as well.
It is cool. And there's two things that stand out for me. One is, of course, just that idea of the patch management, keep your WordPress, Joomla, Magento, all of that up to date. We didn't cover it last week, but John had pointed out that there was yet another critical vulnerability reported for poor Magneto. But the other thing, too, that I thought was kind of interesting here is that looking at the command and control servers, they're using Dropbox, GitHub, meaning some pretty, unsurprisingly, some pretty common traffic patterns, likely some traffic that is allowed by your egress filters within your environment, possibly not your production environment for GitHub and Dropbox. But who knows? So there's some really interesting things here to talk about your product security incident response team, as well as in that sense of, are we patching, but also how better are we protecting against this type of spread? So great aspect from that. And John, I think I stepped on you when you were trying to say something too.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this before. WordPress is WordPress is secure. WordPress plugins notoriously have really bad security. I say as someone who used to do development for WordPress and Drupal. But what I want to bring up here, sort of bring it back to our listener base and talk about AppSec, this is a really good example of, we tend to, I think, probably sit a little bit too much in our bubble of people who care about application security and are actually working on doing secure code, whereas someone who's writing a WordPress plugin, are really, I'd say most of the rest of the industry outside of our bubble, they're focused on getting some sort of functionality out and then, hopefully making money off it in many cases if they're not trying to do something just for the hell of it. So think about, how do you get those guys to think about security? And if I remember right, I don't think this article covers it. Yeah, it doesn't. But there was another one out there on this topic around this malware. WordPress security team has actually now gone out and forced updates on, I think, 2 or 3 of the plugins which were being leveraged. So they usually, the process is, someone finds a security vulnerability, they tell the plugin authors, they do nothing. They tell WordPress tries to, encourage some sort of change, but usually it's slow. You don't want to go and modify someone's code for them. But in this particular case, they stepped in and then actually fixed it. So, how do you get people outside of our bubble to think about this type of thing? And sort of look at the question I asked Caesar in the last segment. How do you, it's a constant thing for me. How do you communicate with management? How do you communicate with people outside of your bubble to encourage and increase the awareness of this type of thing? So I think that's interesting to think about when we look at something like this.
Yeah, because what I think is interesting, John, when we think about a website, for example, that happens to link into maybe a self-service portal to log into your software, and there's a number of technologies out there, there's some sponsors out there that leverage that kind of make it really easy to log in. There's this interesting crossover with your WordPress site and your actual application and what's happening here. And it's just something we see. I do a lot of work in keeping our website up to date, and the number of plugins that I have to, update to make sure everything's working and stay secure. To your point, WP Engine, who we use for WordPress, does a really fantastic job from a security perspective. It's managing all the darn plugins that's a pain in the butt.
Yeah. And, that's a good sort of tie back to something else we've talked about recently, which is sort of the rise of identity management over really the last year, but I'd say the last 2 or 3 years of, you want to make that as simple and seamless for the end user. And thinking about, we had Jim on here talking about JWT tokens and different ways to actually pass auth through the system and authorization through the system. But then again, in this case, do you want to think about, it's a good chance to start doing some, I think we're going to talk about in other articles too, but risk management, threat modeling around, okay, that WordPress is going to log into my third-party system or some other system, but do we want to really think about what level of access we're giving over that connection, or how do we check to see if it's normal or abnormal, or it's, again, something to think about. And it's frequently outside of our bubble, right? This particular thing, because the WordPress site or the public marketing site is usually run by marketing, not run by the engineering team or security team or things like that. So again, fringe but important.
Yeah, I think you hit on a really important thing, that aspect of that transitive trust. It's really easy to inspect, say, here's WP Engine, here's its security architecture model, here's how we're going to authenticate to it. But once we bring in some plugins that are probably, plugins get used because they're meeting a desired feature, they're meeting a customer need, and what data is being exposed to that, and how is authentication being handed off amongst those, and that's that transitive part that often is really hard to reason through because you don't have a single piece of code you can interrogate, a single configuration. You actually have to look at a bunch of scattered, I'll use the microservice magic phrase, of how all of these are interacting with each other and what was the mistake that was made that opened things up unnecessarily. I'm going to, let's use this as a segue into another article that I thought we could also have a good conversation about, because Matt brought this one up about a couple vulnerabilities, WordPress, Joomla, etc. I had also tagged a list of vulnerabilities from the NSA that was highlighting 25 different CVEs that had been used in active exploitation. And now, one of the reasons I didn't really want to bring this up to talk about CVE soup, because for the life of me, I can't remember any particular CVE numbers anyway. But more interesting to me was sort of the underlying theme about what does this list imply. So they break this out into 7 broad categories that are roughly like remote access, MDM, public-facing servers, internal services, network devices, and so on. But if you just slice these vulnerabilities, these CVEs by year, you see that 13 of them are from 2020, which, okay, we're almost at the end of 2020, but there's some patching that should have been done. But there's one that's all the way back to 2015, and even one from 2017 and 2 from 2018. So there's definitely just something fundamental here in terms of a patch management story, just like Matt was pointing out in the botnet article.
Yeah, and in the ones that, look, there's a bunch of remote access ones in here, which we get, right? The rise of the remote worker, people going after the remote access. There's VPNs in here. There's Citrix ones in here. I get those. Windows always has their remote code executions periodically. We've talked about Microsoft enough. But when you scroll down to the middle, this is where things got interesting for me. Number 14 on the list, Adobe Cold Fusion. Number 15 on the list, Oracle WebLogic 15 server.
What?
That's the one from 2015. That vulnerability's been out there for 5 years, and it's listed as the 15th most critical vulnerability. People, come on, 5 years? I know Oracle's a pain in the butt, but it's not that bad. And then Oracle is number 16. So those were the ones I really honed in on in this article, Mike, because I'm like, those are the really application security ones, and some of these are 3 and 5 years old that are still hanging out there.
But think about it though. If you've built an application, if you are at some point in your life, you're building an application that needs an app server like WebLogic back in the day. That's not something you did over a weekend, right? So you put a lot of effort into developing that, a lot of costs, and now you're asking me to go ahead and you're I'll say in air quotes, forcing me to have to update the application. And this, we've already spent money. You're asking me to spend more money on it again. It's just doing one thing. Joe, who wrote it 5 years ago, he's at 3 other companies since. We don't know anything about this. The documentation was on a drive which wasn't being backed up, and that got compromised in the last hack. You know how this goes. So I can see why it's like that. But again, how do you mitigate it? Can you put a WAF in front of it? Can you ACL it down so only the 3 people who still need to access this thing twice a year for financial reporting are able to get to it? What can you do to sort of really put it off into the corner and not go from my microphone here?
Well, I'll put an F5 big IP proxy and load balancer with CVE 2020-5902 in front of it. Oh, that won't work.
There you go.
Nope, yeah. But
wait, are they sponsoring us?
Not anymore. No, but John's making them. Yeah.
There's a bunch of these technologies, though, that are also providing these gateway services that have vulnerabilities in them. At some point, you have to decide, what are you going to do with this thing? Are you going to patch it, or aren't you going to patch it? It's been 5 years. Are you going to upgrade it? Maybe this is a way to reduce some tech debt and maybe move that service off. If the NSA's got it on its number 15 list and it's 5 years old, you got to ask the question, what the heck are we going to do about this? I mean, you got to look inside and go, really, guys? We really should do something about this.
I'll tell you exactly when that's going to get patched, and that's when if a company who's running this, and this is going to sound negative, I'm sorry, but it's just real life. If a company who's running this is going through a third-party on-site audit to get some sort of a certification to do further business, and that shows up as one of the top findings that's about to be handed to the customer who's about to write them a large check, that's when this will get fixed. If it hasn't been fixed by now, the NSA telling someone to fix it isn't going to fix it. Lists like this, and again, sorry, got my negative hat on. Lists like this are loved by vendors, patch management vendors, security vendors, because they're able to give you a new report which shows you stuff that's on there. Some people might fix it, if the CEO is looking at coffee on Monday morning and he sees us or he's listening to us, Application Security Weekly, and he hears us talk about it, then they might go back and check on it. But otherwise, this is hygiene. If people aren't washing their hands for 20 seconds, does the Apple Watch make that much of a difference and get them to actually wash a little longer? It's sort of the same thing.
Yeah, I think
20 seconds
I think
versus
you're right.
5 years.
Am I being too much of a downer? I'm sorry.
No, I think we do attempt to avoid too much cynicism here, of course. But it's going to be that. I think you're right, John. It's going to be sort of that acquisition or that an important buyer writing a big check, or it's going to be that post-breach remediation, much like we've seen with another, like the Tomcat vulnerability in Equifax, something that was around for a long time. As you point out, it may be a big investment to rewrite the code or update the code that's relying on, unfortunately, a very brittle point release. So yeah, very good points made there. I also wanted to sort of turn this around from the idea that, application security isn't just patch management or the SDLC in the sense of what is the life cycle. Hopefully, decommissioning and maintain is part of the SDLC. So honestly, hopefully a lot of these that are 3, 4, 5 years old could just be turned off or migrated into a better cloud native capability. The other thing I wanted to look at, though, from an AppSec perspective is what are some of the underlying themes of the type of vulnerabilities that were in here? And just because I had to make my case for the year, in case anyone was questioning, up near the very top was a directory traversal in CVE 2019-19781. So I was very happy to see myself vindicated that a directory traversal made it onto this list. But the other themes were basically everything we're familiar with, buffer overflows and some deserialization attacks. The buffer flows hopefully are the ones that we should be doing better about, quite honestly. This goes back to John's lamentation about Microsoft and $1 billion of security investments, that how much better are we doing with control flow integrity, with ASLR and our compilers fixing these types of things, or throwing a lot of this software in front of a fuzzer just to be better about finding these types of vulnerabilities. So that's why I want to try to also bring this list to relevance for people writing code to say, what are you doing about these very simple, very familiar buffer overflows, deserialization types of attacks, and of course my favorite, directory traversal.
I think you're right. I saw this in your comments when I was going over our stuff this morning. And what I'm trying to figure out in my head is how can we, as developers or as suggesting to other people, how can we is threat modeling? How do we actually go through and figure out where do we need to be spending that buck to really ensure that something is secure and that we've done not minimum or best practices, but we made it secure. Do we look at our endpoints that are exposed on the internet? Do we look at the standard user inputs? Do you look a little bit deeper in the application? We're going to talk about some fun stuff here later, but that's where I'm trying to figure out how do you really get that targeted focus that allows someone to say with really strong confidence, we know this is, if we get hacked, it's not going to be through this.
Yeah, and that's where I'd like to dive into a lot of the tech stuff and figure out what are the different GCM or ECB or what have you modes of encryption. But Matt still also he's got his business hat on. He's like, basically what you're saying, where should I be spending my money? Should we actually be spending this $10K on a bug bounty, on some fuzzing, on just some better defaults for our compiler? And those are all very important and pretty legitimate questions to say, how can we make sure we don't show up on this list when it comes out next year?
Yeah. Well, I think that ties well into the consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering approach for industrial IoT, because they're giving you a roadmap a little bit here in how to do it for industrial IoT. But here's my question. Shouldn't I be doing the same basic thing for my other applications, even in my other types of environments, even if they're not industrial IoT? And this list is interesting because, John, to your point, where should I be spending the money? Where am I going to get the biggest bang for the buck? This approach says, look, identify your crown jewel processes. Okay, well, we've been talking about asset management for 20 plus years. We still haven't done a good job at it, but it's still a foundational thing. So do I start with my externally facing endpoints? Yes. Do I worry about my inputs? Yes. because these are all important things to know, right? Then you map out your digital estate. Okay, we've been talking about that for how many years, right? Spotlight likely attack paths. We were just talking about threat modeling and attack paths in the cloud environment with Accurix in the session before this. Those solutions that can bring that forward, right? And there's a number of sponsors and other technologies out there that have been able to do this. And then based on doing all that, mitigate and protect based on where the priorities are when you can start to visualize all that. That's where they say you should start. And I think you should do that for everything. I don't think it's focused just on industrial IoT stuff.
Yeah. So I guess we could pivot over to that article. And that was my sort of foreshadowing around threat modeling. There's not great new thoughts in that article. What's new in that article is bringing those thoughts, I think, back to OT, right? So those are before 24 months ago. Did any of us really know what OT was? I didn't. I think that's become really sort of brought into the fold along with the IoT and IIoT industrial. So I think that's where now that's on our radar, and those guys at the same time as they're getting these as really the core point of that. The operational technology, your Siemens devices, things like that for the last decades have been sitting in their own little subnet. Now they're bringing in a Raspberry Pi that's able to talk out to the internet. So now they have to start thinking about those. And I think that's where it's more interesting to them than it is, I think, to most of us.
Why? Because we did the exact same thing with applications. We used to have them sitting behind a firewall, sitting in our environments, and now all of a sudden we're deploying them out to the cloud, distributing them all over. It's the exact same problem. But yet we're not applying the same approach and technique?
Oh, no, because think about it. In a large organization that has, well, even a small organization, any org that has that's using OT, that's usually installed by the Siemens guy who, like, he asks the IT guy for a connection to the to the manufacturing systems. And if you look at that, the Purdue model, which is linked to in this this blog post, you have to go out to Google and actually get a better version of the image so you can read it, unfortunately. But if you look at the Purdue model, where OT sits down at level 1 and 2, levels 1 and 2, that's generally, it doesn't talk anywhere else. So the Siemens guy is doing his thing on his own network. It's, isolated from everything else. And this is why the Stuxnet was so interesting, because they had to get the USB drive into that level 2 or level 3 to actually get the compromise in there. So now it's gone from that model where it was something that security and the rest of the company didn't have to worry about, because the guy who charges $500 an hour to come in twice a year and update the Siemens stuff, it's all his problem. Now it's leaking out. So that's sort of the change there.
Yeah, I think Matt, you're spot on by the things that you were calling about this, that these 4 points sound pretty familiar. I think one of the things that stood out to me, though, is I think, though, that this IoT, this OT, they've got a much better appreciation of availability out of that CIA triad that I honestly, and speaking anecdotally, I don't hear quite as much in the application security space. We always talk about, and we were just talking about with Caesar, encryption data at rest, so that confidentiality. There's some integrity as well that may be falling in both into the idea of here's signing messages and so on. Here's some hashes, HMACs and what have you, as well as just making sure that preventing tampering. But availability often gets hand waved to be like, we'll make this the cloud problem and just use multiple regions. Where availability in this case, in these spaces, means a lot more consequences that are much more visible and possibly much more. I'm using way too many words to describe something that says visible, quantifiable. So I think that might be something that is a little bit more important here. But to your point, hopefully we're going to say that, hey, we were trying to do this 20 years ago. Let's do this now. And hopefully repeating this in a better way that succeeds. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I think the challenge with OT in general is this becomes a safety issue, which is why availability is so important. Because if these safety systems aren't available, we potentially cause loss of life, right? I mean, a lot of OT plants. I worked in nuclear power. I worked at some of the refineries. I know what this stuff can do, and I know what happens when systems fail, right? So to your point, availability is important more from a safety aspect, and we don't take that same safety concern per se to our applications. if we thought about it more from a safety perspective, we might actually be successful in doing this.
Indeed, we might. And we can start to draw some parallels. We started off this year, I was talking about some privacy concepts and privacy engineering. And there are aspects of the trust and safety when we start to talk about abuse. So I think there's still some very important product security conversations we could be having around here, even though we don't have the same availability that if the fail whale comes by and people don't have access to tweet their thoughts of the day for an hour or so, not quite the same impact to safety as it might be in other scenarios.
But
Exactly.
quickly to bring it back to the cost thing, that's spot on what's going on here. A Raspberry Pi in the US, you're looking at what, $50 more or less for a 2 or 4 gig version, 2 gig. If you take that same Raspberry Pi, put it into an encasement so it can be used on the OT side of things, prices I've seen are right around 10 to 15 buy. So it's not cheap to make that stuff really true, either just to ruggedize the device itself to make sure it has to have multiple power sources, better components, they don't fail, all these different things. And then the software on top of it's probably even going to be crazier still. So it sort of points a finger back at us ourselves and saying maybe we're not spending as much as we should be. I'm sure salespeople are going to love me saying that, but
well, I think that gives a good segue into the reason I brought in some articles about some browser security, not so much so to specifically talk about the security, the specific items themselves, but to talk about the approach and the architecture. Because in this conversation we're having about CCE and IoT and building in security, even if they're these 4 points, as Matt pointed out, that sound pretty familiar. There's 2 points I want to make here. One, just an RCE in Google. That also stood out because it was the last, there was in the last 12 months, there was a critical RCE patched last Halloween night. So we actually have at least one more on my Halloween theme, Met thought process. But this was a vuln in FreeType. So this was something that was in, once again, software dependency. Speaking to John's point, we've been talking quite a bit how much Google has been spending on, bug bounties, on fuzzing, on different ways they've specifically done things they've done to harden Chrome. And the other companion article that was about this was Firefox adopting site isolation. And part of the reason I wanted to pull that into was have that discussion to still demonstrate that these buffer overflows are still popping up in FreeType, for example, that was hitting Chrome. It took Firefox 2 years to say, yep, this site isolation that Chrome has been working on and has deployed looks pretty good. And that can actually help us if we put these different websites into different processes. We're at least going to hopefully make it a lot harder for a buffer overflow to compromise cookies for another site or the sensitive information for another site just because we can have it sit in a different process. So it's a great idea and concept, but it took them 2 years to do. And that was one of those things I wanted to highlight, is that I do think it's a great step to take, but you really have to get a support from management, support from that budgeting perspective to say, we're going to spend 2 years fixing something, improving our architecture, but we're still going to run into some overflows. So don't think that we failed, please. And that's my positive message of the day.
I'll keep my mouth shut.
All downhill from here.
Now for the rebuttal. John, you're up.
The rebuttal, man. Firefox, and I'm trying to dance very carefully around Firefox because I love them. I love what they do. I've known folks over there. They've obviously had issues this year around finances and trying to figure out what the future of Firefox looks like. So I get that we could possibly say they've worked on the things they shouldn't have and maybe didn't focus as much on their core product as they should have. But still, it's like I was just saying, 5 minutes ago, it's getting the engineering resources to work on some of these things. I mean, it's there's an open source package. I'm looking at OpenHab. I want to be able to control 2 houses from an iOS app, but they never wrote that concept in. They didn't think of that concept of, hey, someone might want to be able to control 2 home automation systems. So now you go have to modify logins, you go have to modify a bunch of configuration settings, you go have to modify a bunch of stuff. And I haven't written Swift in years. It's not something I'm really looking forward to. So think about how the guys at Firefox were feeling like. We have to go through and actually separate all this stuff for to work on to have each tab be individual. How are you going to start doing shared memory? How are you going to do graphics? How are you going to do all this stuff? So it's a heavy lift. I get that. Happy to see they're doing it. I actually tried to turn it on my Firefox, and one of the options isn't working. So I'll test it at some point. But it's again, it's what I asked last week from listeners, what do you want us to talk about, or do you want us to talk about these bugs, and I got some feedback around a little more of the how do you actually how do you run with this? How do you work with this? How do you not just look at the bug, but what do we do about fixing it? So that's why I'm trying to approach some of this stuff. And this is a good example again. It's like if you're a developer in a team, and like you imagine if you're seeing the Firefox team and you see Chrome working on this and releasing it, how do you get your management and people on your side of the fence to say, hey, we need to take this a little more seriously? And I know they've been working on it more than just the last month or two, right? So this is something they've been active on. But still, that's a good example for people to think about. What do you do? How do you encourage favor to work on things you think are important?
Yeah, and it's a big difference between here's a really easy here's a really easy win to show off. In a 2-week sprint, I can fix this one buffer overflow or this overwrite past the end of an array, or how we're handling it in a PNG, something like that. But there's a big difference between the time it takes to have fix that one bug in a 2-week sprint versus just what you're saying, re-architect into a much more secure foundation over a 2-year period. And that one doesn't have that immediate gratification. It's a lot harder to plan for, and making sure you actually have that really good buy-in to say, yep, this is our vision, let's execute on it. And it's going to be a pain to drag everyone along, but hopefully has a really positive payoff. And I also in the show notes highlighted to pointed to Google's their documentation around site isolation, as well as a link to a Safari blog just describing how this how site isolation, how their approaches came out to protecting from Spectre and Meltdown and those types of speculative attacks. So that's why I say there's some really interesting things that can come out as a positive from making these types of architecture decisions and investments, but you've really got to have a strong voice to be able to call attention to them and execute.
Yeah, I think that there's a blog post in there, the WebKit one, that does the walkthrough you're just talking about of the link's not in front of me, but the one that does the walkthrough of like, okay, here's how WebKit taught about rejiggering our code for either Spectre or for Meltdown. And they're sort of almost good interview questions for people to think about. If someone came up to you and said, hey, there's a security problem in your CPU that's going to result in branch conditions possibly being modified, and usually we'd use branch conditions for doing an if test on security, how do you work around that? So I think it's actually a really good blog post for people to think of and actually, try to think a little bit ahead of what you're reading. How would you deal with this? And then how they've taken care of it. I think it's actually really cool.
Yeah, it's like absolutely agree. It's really speaking to that idea of you don't have to get the answer correct from a technical perspective. At least I think so in a type of interview question. You're really calling out what's your threat modeling, what's your your risk-based thinking. Do you understand the problem, and how are you reasoning through different trade-offs to solving it? And that's a great tie-in to, I think, to end the episode on a keynote presentation from Kelly Shortridge at Sneak. They had their one of our sponsors. They had a online conference just last week, and this one was really good. It spoke to me in the sense of eradicating the idea of security theater, and it's coming back to that theme of how do we make sure security is coming to a DevOps team or another team and introducing controls and a conversation that's actually productive versus something that is just, here are some tests for the sake of testing. Here's some checklists, or here's some approval points for the sake of having an approval point. And so this is a really, really well presented argument for what those negative aspects look like, and what a positive future looks like is what she was describing as sort of a chaos security engineering, as much as just a very developer focused one, which is similar to the conversation we were having with Caesar about how a DevOps team embracing configuration management, remediation, as code, and making sure that conversation with security is actually working in a way that's positive for developers and not stepping on, back and forth flipping when they're trying to make legitimate changes that might differ from a baseline, and actually make those changes in a way that work with security and have legitimate reasons to support the business.
Yeah, it seems like there's a few good talks in there. I haven't watched this one yet, but just to clarify, because that blog page doesn't say it, Kelly's over at Capsulate. So I don't want people to think that, at least last time I checked, I don't want people to think that someone's moving or changing or we're saying the wrong thing.
No, it was SNCCon 2020, but she's at Capsulate. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
But there's a bunch of good stuff in there, and it's security theater. That's I think I've used up my my snark for today, so I'll smile and nod.
Well, we'll give you a week to recharge, and that will be good, John. No worries. And so while John takes the week to recharge the snark, and Matt goes and he's going to actually jump into Business Security Weekly and the rest of our shows for the week, so make sure you're also watching him. I want to thank him for joining us here on Security Weekly. As always, I want to thank John for joining us. I want to thank all of you who are joining me in particular and suffering through my horror movie references for the month of October. We'll be returning next week in November to something else new and scary, because I'm pretty sure there's going to be some vulnerable code out there to talk about, as well as some positive ways we could talk to development teams to perhaps address and fix that code. So with that, thank you once again for joining us. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.